So if we could start off with some basic information. So can I have your name, your date and place of birth, and your current status, please?
Okay, my name is John Molyneux. My date of birth was 2nd of September 1948. I was born in Cheltenham in England. I now live in Dublin. I'm retired formally, but I'm very busy on lots of things.
Okay, John, can you tell me a little bit about your background, your upbringing, that sort of thing?
Okay, I grew up in London, mainly, not only, but mainly in London in the 50s and 60s. My mother owned a rather unusual boarding house, which we lived on the ground floor of. This was in Belsize Park. But it was unusual because it was very multicultural, and we had all sorts of people like Indian communists and people like that living in that, and artists and various people, which was an interesting upbringing. I went to a fairly conventional grammar school. Then I went to university. I went originally to Cambridge University, but for complicated reasons I won't go into here, left almost immediately. And then I was a student at Southampton University from 1967 when all this kicked off.
Would you say that you had a particularly political upbringing, or was politics just something that wasn't discussed in your family?
No, my mother was a odd combination. I didn't have a father around. My mother was a kind of radical anti-racist Tory, which was a kind of odd, but she was quite political in various ways. But I didn't have a political upbringing in the sense of I had activist or political parents who, you know, introduced me to the movement in any way. That happened to me largely of my own accord. I was very much affected by the mood of things in the 60s, so I was interested while at school in things like Bob Dylan, jazz, blues, beat poetry, Allen Ginsberg, that sort of thing. And I was quite rebellious. I'd have been, I suppose, some kind of anarchist in my teens.
And so before you go to France and experience the events of '68, were you involved in any social or political activism?
I was. When I became a student at Southampton University, which was in the autumn of 1967, I immediately kind of was involved in talking to and meeting other left-wing students, I think I can't remember the exact sequence, but I think I joined something called the Socialist Society there, and I had a brief encounter with what was then called the Socialist Labour League, which was the forerunner of Jerry Healey's Workers' Revolutionary Party. I didn't get on with them, didn't stay around them very long. They were very authoritarian. But also I went, again, this was for personal reasons that I didn't explain, because I'd had a relationship. I was married, actually, in a technical sense, to an American woman from Chicago, and I went to see her. We were separated, and then I went to see her over Christmas, 67 to 68, and various experiences there had a big effect on me. In particular, in New York, seeing the extreme contrast between massive wealth and great poverty, which were more dramatic than anything I'd seen in London or in Britain at the time. You know, it was, and that had a big influence on me. And then also, when I came back to England after that, I got involved in various things like the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and I was in the, I went to the Vietnam Solidarity March, which went to Grosvenor Square in the spring of that. This was all before the May events happened. So I was new to the movement, but I was looking around and talking to people, and I had quite a few friends at Southampton University who were involved in one way or another, and I was starting to read some Marx and so on.
So what brought you to France then in May?
Well, I was, as I said, I was already engaged in the movement. The Grosvenor Square Vietnam demonstration had a big impact on me, and I saw on the television what was going on, and here I was at Southampton. It was fairly easy to get over to France, and I thought, I saw things like the Night of the Barricades on the 10th of May, saw this on the television, and thought, I'm going to go and see what's happening. It was so I took myself over. Simple as that, really.
So you weren't studying in France at the time, you just went over explicitly?
I went over. No, I was a student at Southampton University, and I went to France with the specific aim of checking out what was happening.
And can you remember what date around what
I was trying to remember this in preparation for this interview, and I wasn't sure. I think it was probably the weekend following, the week after the Night of the Barricades and so on. I think probably around the 17th or so of May. I didn't record it, I'm afraid. But there was, I was there for about 3 or 4 days. Probably from something like the 17th. The general strike was on and in full flow when I got there. That's an obvious marker. But I think it was about the 17th to 20th of May. But I can't be sure of that at this.
Okay.
Time.
And had you been to France before?
I have been to France before, but just like on holiday and so on. You know, I'd been to Paris before.
And what were you studying at university?
I was studying Southampton. I was studying English literature.
Okay.
But which was a legacy of my schooling. You know, where there were a very limited range of subjects, and you were supposed to do English, or if you were a humanities person, English and history I did, and then so on. And I sort of carried on a conveyor belt from there through Cambridge to Southampton. Not that I wasn't interested in it, I was very interested in it, but as a result of my politicization in 67 to 68, I changed my course and studied modern history and politics.
Okay, right. We can come on to that a bit later. So do you think, or can you recall being surprised at something like this happening, or was it in the air? Was it something that you expected?
I think both things are true. I think that it was definitely in the air of those times, you know. I mean, it's almost a song, isn't it? There was something in the air. You know, I mean, there was definitely a revolutionary consciousness among a whole layer of young people in those times, which had a mixture of elements to it, you know, like things like the Dialectics of Liberation conference that took place in the Roundhouse in Chalk Farm, just down the road from where I grew up, which I wasn't at, but I knew people who were at it and so on. So you had that, you had the countercultural elements, and then you had political elements within it, which, you know, the Vietnam War, the American Student Revolt, which my American wife had been involved in. So this was all around. I mean, you could go through the whole, and I was aware of all this and interested in all this. So in that sense, it was in the air, but in another sense, you know, nobody was expecting it in France. The man famously quoted a lot, isn't it? André Gortz, one of the leading French intellectuals, had written this essay in which he said, you know, there isn't going to be a general strike or people taken to the barricades in France in the foreseeable future. I think he wrote that about like a few weeks before it happened. You know, so nobody was particularly expecting that to happen in France. So in that sense, it was a surprise, yes.
And how important were the changes from a cultural perspective at that time? You've mentioned a few times music, but also fashion and generational change. Is that something that was in your mind at the time?
Yes, I think it was impossible to be a kind of engaged or aware person in London in the 60s without being aware of that in lots of different levels. And for me, I think probably the music and literary influences came before direct politics, so that I was in the sixth form at school and so on. There was a group of us who were listening to jazz and blues music, and that so you were listening to Charlie Parker or Billie Holiday or some damn phone going. Sorry.
Okay, it's okay. It's fine.
Sorry?
Okay, just go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Listening to and Bob Dylan and so on. So there was all that happening. And then I was reading the Beat poets, Allen Ginsberg and so on. In particular, he had a big influence on me and so on. So I think all that was created a general sense that there was a different world out there from what you were being taught by your teachers or seeing on the television or the mainstream. And it all, I mean, of course, it was very divergent. I don't think it was entirely the same thing as the political movements that developed, but there was certainly a point in the mid to late 60s where those things converged to some extent. They were, I think, probably looking back, I would say they were two movements which were to some extent moving in different directions, but they certainly crossed over and were very, especially I think when people were not very worked out politically, they were all jumbled up together in a kind of rather creative and good way, but they were certainly all factors there in my consciousness at that time.
So talk me through what happened when you got to France. How did you get there? Where did you go? How were you received? What did you do?
Well, I flew over and landed at Beauvais and then got, I think, a bus or something into the center of Paris, and I headed for the Sorbonne. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't politically connected in the sense that people said, go to this place or that place. I just turned up.
Right.
And then I just started talking to people who the Sorbonne was occupied. I just started talking to people. There wasn't actually any street fighting when I was there. There was a kind of truce, and it was explained to me that there'd been all this street fighting and everybody needed a break from it. And the streets were lined with kind of pickets or patrols that were designed to stop conflict breaking out on the streets. But the Sorbonne, there was infirmary. You could see people walking around with their heads bandaged, various other sort of things that they'd had from getting battened or whatever. You could see all the streets with the cobblestones ripped up and the debris of barricades, all of that you could see around. And I just found people to talk to. I didn't speak French, but I found people I could communicate with. I spoke a little schoolboy French, not fluent French, but and I stayed the night in the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne was occupied. I stayed in the Sorbonne. You could just find rooms to sleep in, which is what I did, and talk to people. And then, so I found people were delighted to talk to you and excited and in that sense welcomed.
So how long did you stay for?
I'm not sure now. I think it was about 3 to 4 days.
Okay, and what did you do? What did you do for 3 or 4 days?
I walked around Paris. I went to, I talked to people as much as I could, and I went particularly as well from the Sorbonne. I went to the École des Beaux-Arts, the art school, which had been taken over by the students and where they were producing the now iconic posters and photographs and so on. I collected some. I bought some, or got from them. I don't know if I paid a donation or something, but I acquired some wonderful photographs of the street fighting, which I no longer have. Tragically, I had them for a long time, but I haven't got them now. So I went there and was very interested to see the poster production going on. And I went to the Odeon, the National Theatre, where this had been occupied, and it was handed over to the students by, I've forgotten his name now, the legendary French actor. Do you know who I mean?
Yeah, it's on the...
yeah, I can't think. I know him.
Jean-Louis Barrault,
Sorry?
Jean-Louis Barrault?
Yeah, yes, indeed. He was director of it, and he had handed it over to the students. And there was a kind of process which was very impressive, permanent debate going on in there. I wasn't always sure how exactly it worked, but people were getting up and giving great speeches, and then somebody else would reply, and so on. So that seemed to be going on non-stop. So that's what I did. I met various people, none of whom I stayed in contact with, but I talked to people. I was very impressed by the fact that in the Sorbonne, in the room where I was staying, I went around the room and asked who everybody was and so on, and none of them were actually students. I found that very striking. They were all actually people who had come to join the revolution, mostly young workers. I read about this phenomenon later, but it struck me at the time. It's very interesting.
So, you stayed for a few days. How did you get back to England?
Well, same way I came. I went back and got back. I'd booked like a plane of some sort. I'm trying to stop this ringing. I'm sorry.
Take your time. It's fine. Take your time.
Oh, it's annoying me. I do apologize. Sorry, I'm back.
It's totally fine. The reason I ask about this, how you travel back and forth, is that a number of the people who I've spoken to have talked to me about this way of getting out of France during the events, which kind of runs contrary to the idea that France was shut down and you couldn't get anywhere, but somehow there was the possibility to get a flight from Beauvais back to England. And
yeah, I'm afraid I didn't give that any thought at the time. I just did it, so, and I never researched that aspect of it afterwards, but you could do that, yes. Yeah. I mean, I did have, the general strike was very evident. You could see the fact that there was a general strike going on and lots of stuff wasn't functioning. But obviously, those planes were still flying. And there was some way of getting from Beauvais to Paris, clearly.
And it's funny because you're at least the 6th or 7th person to mention this, getting the bus from Place de la République to Beauvais and then getting the...
Yeah.
So, I mean,
it's interesting you asked me. I'd never thought about this. I thought a lot about the events and what I saw and read quite a lot about it. I never thought about that particularly until you asked. Just happened. Yes. I mean, when I went, although I was politicized and excited, I wasn't politically very knowledgeable. I'd only been around on the left for 2 or 3 months and not had any kind of much training or education, etc. I mean, if I had been more connected and known more people or been a member of an organization or if I'd been in London in circles, I think I would have gone much more aware of what to look for and ask and checked out a lot of things and gone with much more kind of critical consciousness. I didn't have all that. I just thought, oh, that looks interesting. I'll go and see what's happening. Simple as that.
Very good. I'll ask you some specific questions now, some of which you've already touched on. So one of the big talking points around 68 is this sort of accepted idea that somehow there was an attempt between attempt by students to get in contact with workers, but the sort of dominant narrative says that this never happened. Did you have any experience of workers and students coming into contact that you could elaborate on?
Well, I touched on that already, in the sense that the people I met in the Sorbonne were people who had come to join, and they were by and large young workers of one sort or another. But they were not organized workers. They were not delegations from the factories and so on. Now, I do know that there were various kind of attempts to bring workers and students together, and they were also resisted. But we come on to the politics of this, and it raises the question of the role of the French Communist Party, that by and large was the dominant influence in the workers' movement, and also the role of the various kind of groupuscules on the left in all this. So that was my personal experience. But at the time of going, I was not connected to anybody in a way that would have led me to interrogate that more. But of course, I read about it subsequently. So that's my experience, was that there were young working class people coming to join in, and it was mainly these people that I was talking to, and they were talking about, really, they tend to be talking about how their consciousness had been dramatically transformed. And that was one of the things that struck me most about my experience there, was how quickly people were changing. People who considered themselves ordinary people, as it were, in quotes, not having any kind of revolutionary or radical awareness before these past few weeks, were suddenly now questioning everything. And I think that was an extremely important experience to see.
Another thing that you briefly touched on, which is one of the cliches about 1968, is this idea that everybody was speaking to each other. They use this term in French called la prise de parole, where everybody sort of spoke to each other and opened up. Did you experience that, and how?
Yes, I think that I did experience that, and that was very much what was going on in the people I was talking to in the Sorbonne and in the École des Beaux-Arts, and you could see it happening in a very dramatic way in the Odeon, in the National Theatre, because although these were kind of formal debates, they were also kind of dialogue going on continuously with people. So I think that was a feature of what you saw, and I think that is also probably not just unique to May '68, but probably a feature of revolutions, where we can talk about, I don't know if you want to go into that sort of thing, but the extent to which May '68 was a revolution or not. But I think it's a feature of those situations where the mass of people suddenly, a large mass of people suddenly take to the streets, become involved, start doing things as well, that people start talking to each other on a big scale. I think, I remember rightly, John Reed in his classic account of the Russian Revolution refers to the same thing happening in Petrograd in 1917, so I think that was a feature of the times.
And we're in those conversations, those debates, and those discussions. What were people talking about? Were they talking about revolution, or were they talking about reform?
I think people. I don't have records on it. I'm going in the very vague memories here, but I think people were talking about a radical transformation of society, and they were talking about, what I remember particularly was the critique of consumer society, which was, I think, on probably probably a weakness for the movement to be anti-consumerism. But in terms of offering a way forward to workers, but that was very much in the air. That was the way people were talking. They saw themselves And I think they were thinking very much in terms of revolutionary. But remember, I'm speaking to the people who joined the movement by coming to the Sorbonne and taking part and so on. So they're likely to be thinking in those terms, I think.
Yeah. What experience did you have of any violence in 1968? And would you describe the events as a violent moment?
Well, I didn't have any direct experience. As I said to you, there was a kind of truce going on. All I saw was I'd seen the violence on the television, and I expected to see violence when I went, but I didn't. But what I saw was the consequences, the remnants, the traces of it. As I say, the lots of people from the infirmary and people walking around with bandages around their heads and that sort of thing, and the debris on the streets, which was very, very clear. I remember looking at the cobblestones that had been ripped up with a good deal of terror, thinking that if you got hit by one of those, you'd probably kill you. People did actually, they get to get, but that's how it looked, because you could see these things. So I think that was certainly an important element in it, and it is clear that what sparks the mass response of the population, the support for the students, was the CRS violence against them on. Which was pretty extreme. So, I mean, that is what produces the first general strike of the 13th of May, I think it was, and so on. So that element of violence was there, and it was there in my consciousness, but I didn't actually participate or witness it.
Okay. When you were there in Paris, was there any sense that this was a revolt that was happening elsewhere in France, or was it thought to be a Paris-centric?
Oh no, I think you definitely felt that this was this Paris-centric, yes, inevitably, but that this revolt was happening elsewhere, and that this was a national revolt, especially because of you did have this national general strike, so. That was in full flow when I was there, and you definitely had an awareness of that. Yeah.
And I suppose you could, as an international student at that time, you were well placed to answer the following question: was there any sense that what was happening in France at that time was part of something broader? Because we know now that at the time these sorts of revolts are kind of happening everywhere. Was there a sense that somehow France was part of it, and what international issues in particular were discussed?
Well, yes, very, very much so, I think. It's difficult. I realize when you're asking me these questions, it's difficult to separate out what was in one's consciousness at that time and what you then know about later and what you take for granted. But I'm trying to answer in terms of what I would have been aware of then, rather than. But as I've explained to you, I'd already been on the Vietnam solidarity demonstrations. All right, and I think there was, generally speaking, quite a strong awareness for me, and I think for lots of us, about what was happening in America. So that, as I say, my American wife had been involved in the student membership in Ann Arbor, and with University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, with people like Tom Hayden, who died recently, and so on. So there was that, and that there was a strong crossover between the kind of cultural influence that we talked about in America, and another influence that was important was the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers and so on. I mean that, and I was reading about. I was reading some of the text, like I remember reading Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice and so on. So all of that was there as a big cultural influence. So I think that the sense that the French events were connected with that, and with Germany, and Rudi Dutschke, and so on. All of that was very much, I think, part of our awareness. And probably in directly political terms, it was the Vietnam War that was one of the main connectors of this.
Yeah. Can you recall any conversations or any memories of what you were thinking about the political class at the time? And I'm referring in particular to De Gaulle, Pompidou, Mitterrand, Mendes France, the kind of the political elite and how they performed or how they responded to things?
I don't think, I mean, if you look at the time, you know, I don't think I was giving them a great deal of thought. I think I was just there, the establishment, and we're against them, etc. It's interesting looking back to read what happened and what they did, and the way it's clear that, you know, De Gaulle was actually seriously panicked by this. You know, the way he runs off and goes to see the army, and they kind of strengthen him, and, you know, and he comes back and sort of regains his cool. But it's clear that the French establishment feared a revolution.
Yeah.
And you know, I think he comes back, and eventually De Gaulle reasserts control, and he wins a big election victory and so on. So he you know, retrospectively did quite well, but he was clearly thrown into some degree of panic and fright by what was happening, because I don't think that, generally speaking, establishment politicians and the likes of De Gaulle and Pompidou they don't reckon with these things happening. I mean, it's on a much smaller scale and it's not as dramatic, but in Ireland, where I am now, in 2014, there was suddenly a mass eruption of popular discontent over water charges. And I remember being in the centre of Dublin for the anti-water charges demonstration that we thought was going to be quite a big demonstration. People were talking about, would there be 10, 20, 30,000 people? And suddenly 100,000 people, and none of us were expecting it, and certainly the establishment weren't. And they are still in disarray about it. They still don't know what to do about it, because these things are not supposed to happen. You're supposed to have little protest demonstrations with a few thousand people, and they can be safely ignored. But 100,000 people in the city of Dublin is, you know, you're from Belfast, you know what that means. 100,000 people in the city of Dublin is 1 million people on the streets of London. And it was then followed a few weeks later by something like 200,000 people across the country, with, you know, and when that happens, I think that their first instinct is panic. It's a really seriously disturbing thing for establishment politicians.
Okay.
I think that was true of Pompidou and De Gaulle.
So when you then returned to England towards the end of May, and it wasn't too long then before the political class finally took control of the situation, and things were brought to a conclusion at the end of June with an election victory of the Gaullist party. Can you remember how you felt at the time? Was it a sense of disappointment that didn't go a bit further?
Of course, yes. No, of course there was disappointment, but I think there was also still an extraordinary elation about what you had seen, and for me, it wasn't a disillusioning experience. Or what it did was confirm a decision that I'd already taken. I took the decision to become politically active, to become an engaged socialist. I took that decision really in the course of my trip to America, in New York, in the Christmas. What I saw in Paris confirmed that. It confirmed me in the belief that it was possible. It would be possible to change society. Ordinary people could change society.
Okay.
And so it in that sense, it sealed it sealed my political fate, in fact, in a way, and I've remained politically active and of that conviction to this day.
We'll maybe come back on to that in a moment. I just want to get another couple of questions out of the way. Can you recall how your friends and family felt about you taking this trip to Paris?
Well, friends and family were quite separate. I mean, in this sense, I didn't have much in the way of family. My mother was still in London, and she was by this time kind of used to me doing all sorts of mad things. I had done all sorts of kind of. I probably wouldn't have even told her I was doing it. I don't know. I just my friends were friends at Southampton University who were kind of excited about it and for me and so on. These were already politicized people. When I came back, I wrote an account of what I'd seen done for the student newspaper of the time and so on. So, that was, they would have been generally, come on, tell us what happened, what was it like, etc. So I didn't, that was determined by the nature of the friends I had by this stage.
Okay. How did you perceive the impact on France at the time? So the consequences, sort of short term, and how do you think? Hello, can you hear me?
I lost you momentarily.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, sorry. So I'll start again. How did you perceive the consequences of these events on France at the time, and how do you think that might have developed over time? And what do you think are the big consequences of these events in France, or more broadly?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that in quite the way you put it. I mean, I don't think I would have had a sort of clear view of what the consequences would be for France. I think that I was concerned very much with what the consequences should be for England.
Okay, so do you want to talk about that?
And I think that I immediately was concerned I was concerned with the question of what to do following the experiences of France. And I was looking around the left. As I said, I'd had already an encounter with the Socialist Labour League Workers' Revolutionary Party and not got on with them and severed my ties. I think I joined the Young Socialists for a little while, but then I dropped out of that. But I was looking around the left. I drew the conclusion from what I saw in France that you did need organization. It seemed to me, if you take the question you raised about students and workers, that you needed political organization that could bring students and workers together. And so I looked around the left and in Britain for this sort of situation. That led me to join the International Socialists, who were saying that kind of thing. Didn't really know much about them when I joined, but I heard a bit about them, and I just joined to see how it was going.
Yeah. Did your experience in 1968 change your impression of France?
Well, obviously it did. I mean, the Paris that I knew before was a tourist Paris. So I hadn't really thought of it in that sense, but of course it does. And, but then I suppose the left bank and the Sorbonne and so on becomes part of the story of Paris. And when I've been back to Paris, as I have quite often since, it's one of the places you go to just to reminisce and so on, and you become then aware of the wider history of revolutionary France, and you go to Père Lachaise cemetery and that sort of thing. So in that sense, it was a turning point. But I think really May 68 was a turning point in my it confirmed the decision I made, but it was an important confirmation. It made the difference between something that might have been a passing decision and something that was a major one. And I think it's shaped my whole world outlook ever since, you know, so everything is different after May 68.
Yeah, well, the next question was going to be, so how would you sum up your experience of 1968? How the impact of your experience on you personally and politically? I know you've mentioned this in various ways, but how would you sum up?
I think it was massive. I think it was had a massive impact. I would say a number of things really struck me. I was actually very struck by people's courage. I'd already been struck by people's courage in Grosvenor Square in London. In these situations, people do very, very risky and brave things, and often foolhardy. It's strange because the image in the way they're reported in the newspapers and so on is generally that people are violent, evil thugs or something. No, actually what happens is people become, for striving for something they believe in, extraordinarily brave. I'd seen in Grosvenor Square people standing their ground when being charged by police horses, which is an extremely difficult thing to do because it's very frightening. And in Paris, I didn't see the actual fighting, but I was very struck by people's courage in resisting the CRS and fighting back. We're very, very frightening. I've seen that on television, and I saw it, and I told you how frightening. I thought the cobblestones were these great stones that people were digging up and throwing around, etc. That was first one thing. Second thing, I mentioned it already, I was very, very struck by the way in which people's outlook, their consciousness was transforming by the day. You could see that happening, and the way that's what they told you about, and the way, and that was very important because I thought that can happen again in different circumstances. And thirdly, I was struck by the way in which the general strike, I mean, you mentioned the fact that you could still get out on Beauvais and so on, but it was nonetheless, as it were, paralyzing society, the way in which I felt that you could see how the general strike held the society in the palm of its hand, potentially. And so I was struck by the power of workers. And when you talk about the students and the workers getting together, that seemed to, and I've already said this, but that at the time struck me as what needed to happen. So all of that influenced me. I was struck by the conservative role played by the French Communist Party, as I saw it, and that was an important factor because it shaped my consciousness and politics. I was never, I became a Trotskyist, not a Stalinist, and so on. So I thought they played a very conservative and bad role in May '68. So that was very important. I was struck also by what I saw in the Odeon and the École des Beaux-Arts, and the role of artistic creation in all of this, which I thought was brilliant. And that also a factor because I was always very interested in art and ended up later in life as a lecturer in art history and so on. So that was an important moment as well in that respect.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Do you
think?
Well, that's good. That's good. Do you think that 1968 had a bearing on your kind of career trajectory, your life trajectory afterwards?
Yes, it had a huge bearing on my career, life-directed trajectory in the sense, but not directly in that sense of the art history thing, because that came much, much later through chance. But it basically, from that time onwards, May '68, I sort of joined the International Socialists in June or early July, something like that. And I've been an active engaged revolutionary socialists to this day. So now that had an impact on my career in one way or another. I did various kinds of jobs. I think it probably made it much harder for me to get the kind of job I would have liked for a whole period of time. It was a long time before I got a proper academic job, and that was by a kind of back door. And that probably, whatever that was, I don't know. But it changed. I changed my course from literature to history and politics. I did a PhD, which was effectively became a book, but it was kind of it was all fairly uncompromisingly Marxist and socialist and so on. So I didn't really make much in the way of concessions to academic public. So that affected my ability to get a job, I think. But I think a lot of that was connected with that experience.
Okay, very good. Have you kept an eye on how the story of 1968 has been told over the years?
Yes, I have. I'm not in any kind of obsessive way, because I've got a broad range of interests, so I haven't kind of specialized in that. But I remember I think it was 1988, 20 years on, I reviewed 4 books about it. I reviewed Tariq Ali's street fighting years. I reviewed David Coates' book. The other one was Ronald Fraser's Oral History and Chris Harman's The Fire Last Time. So I reviewed those four books about it, and and therefore it's not an area of specialist study for me, but I kept an eye on how these things are dealt with. Yes, I think that generally speaking, there is a tendency to separate what happened in May 68 from the Times and to see it as something totally exceptional and unlike any other. I don't really agree with that. There was an exceptional spirit to it, but I don't think it is peculiar to that moment in Paris and so on. I think there's I take what happened in May 68 more seriously than I think a lot of that sounds maybe that's an arrogant thing to say, but what I mean by that is I think there's a tendency to see it as a kind of a situationist drama rather than a real revolutionary struggle. I tend to think it was a real revolutionary struggle. I don't mean by that you could have had a successful insurrection in May 68, if somebody just pulled the trigger. I don't mean that, but I think it was the beginning of a revolutionary situation in a very serious way.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask you one more thing that I've asked everybody. If you were put on the spot and asked to summarize your experiences of 1968 in 30 seconds, how do you think you would do it?
Well, I would say that it was extremely inspirational, and it convinced me that it was possible for the mass of ordinary people to change society for the better, to make a revolution and to make a better world.
Okay.
About 30 seconds. So
that's great.
And can I just add one thing to that? I remember a line, I can't remember who said it, but in Ronald Fraser's book, where somebody who had participated in 68 said, after that, I could never say, as so many people do, it will never happen. I think I would say the same thing. Okay. I was in Athens this summer with my partner. We were on holiday, and we were walking through the streets of Athens, and we saw a graffiti near the Acropolis. It said, "Fuck May 68, fight today." I kind of agree with that as well.
In what way do you agree with that?
Well, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with May 68 or whatever, but I'm not. I think that kind of revolutionary nostalgia is not a great thing. I think that I believe that I'm not interested in living in the past. The past is useful, but not just to sit and reminisce about. So I kind of approved of the spirit of that graffiti, really.
Yeah.
And I thought it'd probably been, I've lost you.
No, you're still there.
Hello? I lost
Yeah.
you.
Hello?
Hello. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. I just say I approved of the spirit of that graffiti. I thought it was probably produced by people who were engaged in the struggles in Greece, you know, Syriza and all that sort of thing, and were fed up with listening to old people tell them about May 68.
Yeah.
So I thought, fair enough.
Yeah. I think
Okay.
that's become a symptom of the way in which the story's been told over the years, you know, that this idea that it became some sort of playful, sort of symbolic revolutionary attempt by a bourgeois bunch of Parisian students somehow has led to this notion that they didn't really revolt, and yet it's held up as some sort of very important moment. And
yeah, no, I think that's all nonsense. I really think that's complete nonsense. And as an art historian, I noticed the way in which it was appropriated by the Situationist International. I don't believe it. Maybe they had some good slogans, but if at the time nobody was talking about the Situationist International, and I think this is an exercise in, you know, this was this great Situationist revolt. No, I don't believe it. I'm not. I mean, keen on art and modern art and all that, but I don't believe it was the Situationists who created May 68 at all. Sorry.
I know, I agree, and I've written that down in some of
my...
Okay.
Good.
I think it's part of the. I think it's part of the layers and layers of things that have been used to. I don't think belittle is the word, but somehow produce.
You're not wrong there. Actually, it sounds a bit but to accommodate it's much easier to accommodate the idea that this was a kind of some kind of middle class indulgence than to see this as a serious revolt. But it was certainly a serious revolt at the time. General de Gaulle doesn't leave the country and go and see the army if he's just because of a few revolting Situationist students. You know, that is not gonna happen.
No,
his strategy for dealing with them would be to give them a few academic posts at the École Normale Supérieure. That's how you deal with that. That's how you deal with that. You don't go get the army.